Okay, so I'll jump into what I'm going to do here, which is a very short section, but certain kind of building from where Peter kind of left us hanging in a certain sense, which is looking at a production which is called Antigone in Calcutta, 1978-79 production in Calcutta of Antigone, directed by Gunther Heyme. Now, this production is quite interesting. Like Peter said, Heyme has a very, very interesting and very complex sort of trajectory of political theatre, starting, working with Piscator, and then doing very famous productions like, and very controversial. Again, a lot of his productions are controversial, and if you have a chance to read the reviews that people are writing about his productions in Germany, then you will see how controversial and how kind of disparaging in certain senses. And what we are going to look at here especially is a moment when he's in one of his crises, from movement from one as a head of one theatre group and after a lot of controversy moving to another. In midst of that period, he's actually coming to India and kind of it's its first kind of really strong intervention in India, engagement in India, and will continue to be the only engagement in certain sense, but an engagement that he himself would say is actually quite important for his own journey as a theatre artist, right? So we are going to look at certain problems of looking at a production like Antigone in Calcutta, which as we will see, these are his, some of the visuals from thing is happening. No, oh, no, it's there. Okay. Okay. Here it is. Okay. Yeah. So what we are going to look at is a production in Calcutta when he sort of he's moving, like I said, he's moving, but the production is quite important for his own kind of framing of his life journey as an artist. And it is a very short interaction. One could say it is, in a kind of larger sense, more like what would later become residency programs, that you come as an artist, particularly in visual art, an artist or a writer coming to a place, staying there for a month and kind of engaging with a space, etc. This could be kind of, in a sense, Heyme's sort of intervention could be seen in a larger sense of certain kind of a residency kind of work. Now, what is more interesting is that, when we are kind of framing it also like this as a question also, a production like this, and you will see the scale of the production is huge. It is extremely controversial in its time, but looking at Indian theatre historiography, theatre history in India, historiography in India especially, you will see that this is not something that is ever discussed, except Bengalis who would know of that generation, who kind of talk about it in an extremely controversial way. But so it created a lot of press, it created a lot of debates at that point, became a site of really contestation, and yet sort of it's completely absent from any kind of discussions. And that is one kind of really point that one kind of have to engage with when one sees like this. And the second point is that, and very quickly, 78, 79, and by the 80s, you will have a certain kind of discourse of interculturalism, which we look at tomorrow in more closely. You will have the certain kind of really theoretical frameworks about interculturalism, huge productions like Mahabharata becoming very, very iconic in the global discourse of theatre, and yet certain kind of early productions which might be otherwise seen within a lens. If it is done today, you would be, or if it was done at least 10 years later, this would have been called or framed as an intercultural production, people would have framed it like that, etc. That also does not kind of happen. So it's very interesting that even the discourses that we know as interculturalism, as certain kind of frames, are actually very, very kind of emerge at certain points. Whether we call this intercultural or not, that's a different question, and we'll come to that towards the end of my short presentation. But we could see how those are extremely contextual. and maybe we need to really probe on the assumptions and basis and where those discourses are probably emerging and the reasons for emergence of some such kind of discourses. Now, so that's kind of my preface to kind of put up. Now, the reason for it is in certain ways larger politics of Cold War, like Vishnupriya that said about Fritz Benowitz is already working in India. He's from East Germany, and here is Max Mueller Bhavan in 2 years before the production, actually having the kind of celebrating Brecht sort of event around Brecht, lot of lectures, discussion, seminar around Brecht, and a dramaturg, Professor Ekin, who works with Heyme, is part of this sort of discussions in the Brecht seminar in Calcutta. And he is the one who goes back and kind of says there is so much interest and kind of engagement. People are desiring a certain kind of engagement with Brecht, and that is what we need to give them. And he would say something very, very interesting, which would kind of come up later also when we look at some of these kind of works, which is that I was showing them the Brecht scenography, the staging, design, etc., and people would gape as if they are seeing, you know, kind of opulent Taj Mahal, and then kind of think of their own situations as not, you know, kind of economically not that high. But he would say, therefore, what we need, people are desiring is not necessarily, and that's not the model of giving these sort of big sets and stagings, etc., but an elementary quality of Brecht, and people are kind of desiring for that, and that could become a connection to kind of think of larger kind of relations with West Germany. And it's interesting that West Germany also then picks up Brecht as the central point to kind of start intervening, and this is probably one of the first kind of interventions by the Goethe or what is called Max Mueller Bhavan. And you can see over the history, from whether it's Max Mueller Bhavan in Calcutta to Max Mueller Bhavan in Delhi, you can see over the years of what they have facilitated or tried to kind of do, whether it's bringing, you know, writers, theatre practitioners, and other filmmakers and other kind of interactions made possible. So this is also the kind of, so this is have very deep kind of histories of, or they are deep rooted histories of Cold War. And this is a very conscious kind of India as a peculiar space where certain kind of engagements have to be done. And Brecht become, ironically for West Germany, also the space to kind of do. And then they kind of really think of Heyme as a figure, because he's a very, very important director, but regarded as a political theatre, who has engaged with Brecht very strongly, but also to the point of doing certain Brecht, so that he's banned from doing Brecht by the Brecht Foundation. So it's a peculiar figure who sort of engages, but comes to, so he comes to Delhi with certain kind of plans, but that does not materialize. He has certain lectures there, but then quickly decides that next year what he would plan to do is certain, you know, is this production, that Antigone as placed within Calcutta. Now you will see Paul Chalish, Wolf Munzer as a designer, Alok Ranjan Das Gupta's translation. There is a lot of work on that, very important translation of the Greek text into Bengali, and Subrata Roy Chaudhary, who is actually a very important, renowned Hindustani musician, who's sort of popular in Germany, quite very well known in Germany. And so this is sort of really the space from which they are coming, is where they are. Okay. Okay. Oh, okay. So, so this is sort of like a lot of these sort of collaborations. The people who are coming together are people who are quite well known in Germany or in the space from which the kind of productions are designed. There's a lot of discussions at that point that is sort of emerging. And to kind of really come to the specificities of production, and one of the most most important and most kind of debated and interesting thing about the production was that it is actually not conceived as a proscenium production, but it is done on the grounds of the St. Paul's Church, a very iconic church within the heart of Calcutta. This is done on the grounds of it, and this is probably the first time they are renting it out, and then they start renting it out for marriages, etc. But this is something that is done for the production. They find this sort of huge space outside the of the church itself, and what they did with that space, we will kind of come to it a bit later. Now, like I said, Cold War, that is one kind of really important framework to understand what is going on. And that kind of raises certain kind of issues, especially in a space like Calcutta, which is really kind of really stark and a period that we might not necessarily can imagine from at this point, that it's an absolute stark division of certain kind of political divisions. So, a space like Max Mueller Bhavan is a space that some people who would be on the left or who would kind of align with certain kind of work with GDR would never have entered in their life, and they would never enter. So it is a stark sort of political divisions, because here is a director coming from West Germany, therefore is coming with certain kind of projects of the Cold War, and we are not therefore going to engage at all. Now, that's a very interesting and very complex space to kind of imagine from the position that we are in present, when, you know, unipolar world, or, you know, certain other models of thinking about the world. But more than that, it also kind of really is a space to kind of this sort of crisis, and a lot of controversies around it is because of this stark political situation. So, if Utpaldat is saying that there is a third space of looking at it, which is the audience, which is the final way to kind of really understand what is going on between the, you know, character, actor, etc. In a certain sense, these sort of exchanges may be the test, or, you know, what is done in the production or not in the production, you know, kind of, it's not simply about have they represented something correct or not correct, authenticity, rather than those debates, what it kind of produces within the larger public sphere in terms of its impact, its effects, ripple effects even, is actually far more, and those are kind of ridden with contradictions, and those will be something that will really need to parse out, and that is where actually we can see what theatre does in certain ways. So, one of the most important points, of course, was about the production that became controversial was, of course, the funding, because this was a really not necessarily large funding, considering, you know, in terms of Heyme's own, you know, kind of theatre production, what he does in Germany, but within the Indian context, this is a really, really high kind of funding that is given, and it kind of really making an argument that an actor would be paid even for the duration of the rehearsals, right, and kind of paid 3,000 per month, which is quite a kind of amount at that point, which is sort of a certain kind of push for professionalization of theatre, which is not in this, you know, and that condition, it is not there. It's in a space of amateur theatre, you are kind of really doing something really of that scale. They would audition, therefore, and to find around 40, it's a big ensemble cast, around 40 actors, so they will finally find 32 actors. But because of even the first stage of sort of political kind of divisions, lot of mainstream actors or people part of the groups are not applying. They do not want to kind of associate with the project at all. So what they end up is actually a far more younger or even amateur cast, who have not otherwise done too much work. So it's very interesting. So that kind of, it's certain kind of limitation, even though you have so much funding and so much certain things to do, but that space does not allow you actually give you to the actors in certain ways that might actually be quite more kind of malleable, but they would work with it, and kind of it raises other tensions there, which is kind of interesting. Now, I'll just sort of leave that there, and then we'll come back to certain parts of what is this? I think something is happening with so, oh, I think there is some, okay. Do you have a pen drive? Do you have a pen drive, for instance? I don't know, my computer is
my presentation.
Hmm. I think it just sort of
Empty the
bin.
dustbin and then sort of.
I don't know what is suddenly it sort of started saying this. It's just I think maybe it's something about installation or some nonsense. But
One, two, three. PPT is working.
If you have the PPT, you can simply convert it into a PDF and then show it.
Vishnu.
Program problem. Folder.
Ask them to open the airdrop.
Yeah, it's open.
PDF, it will play like a PPT.
politics, money, funding, that is kind of the really, we will come back to some of the questions of Cold War later. Now, but most importantly, for us also, I think what's important is also to look at the question of Antigone in Calcutta. Why do somebody wants to do? How do you contextualize? What is that also kind of give us certain kind of political possibilities? And that is something that is quite important in terms of this production. Now, this is for instance Heyme saying the possibility to realize Greek theatre in a Shamiana on mud in a way far off from any fixed civilizational norms. This is not just an effort to escape which interests me in the project, new experience I would like to undergo, but above all, possibility to realize Greek material closer to its origins. Now, that is very interesting, closer to its origins. It implies like hardly like any other drama of three great classicists, the possibility to search for common sources of European and Indian culture and civilization. Now, this is something kind of really kind of larger framework of interculturalism. These becomes very important and interesting, and why this sort of certain questions are coming up. One is this sort of desire for common sources of European and Indian civilization, and Antigone becomes a very interesting text, and Calcutta becomes a site to kind of really do this kind of search, or site becomes a place where you can kind of supposedly stage this. And this sort of idea of closer to Greek origins, why and what does that do? Now, on one is this problem of therefore myth, and as I will say, either the problem of historicization, but a historicization, what could the historicization be in theatre be or look like in certain ways. Now, what he is kind of looking at, and it is also the period of 70s. Now, Heyme has done Antigone before also in Cologne, twice he has done Antigone. So, it is not that he is just picking up Antigone only for Calcutta, he has already done it twice. Now, his also work, like he sort of really invested in some of the very important theoretical propositions on the Greek mythology and ways to historicize Greek mythology, kind of which was sort of important at that point. One is of course the work of some George Thomson, Robert Graves, Ernst Bloch, and of course very importantly Johann Jakob Bachofen, whose Das Mutterrecht, mother right, that is kind of really the important one. Now, which kind of says that there is something about the myths, at the heart of the myths, which is about the real, that it is not something that is fantastical, it is not something that is just imaginative, but it is actually something really condensing the real. So, he would say for instance, Bachofen for instance had the position that the assimilated memory of something historical real, and that is what the myths and definitely Athenian society, and therefore Athenian society could be seen as the highest expression of paternal principle that was arrived to a great extent by an overcoming of an earlier matriarchal culture. So, this was a position that was kind of really very, very strong. So, there is something about Antigone, for instance, what Antigone represents, which is a certain kind of fight between not just two individuals of Antigone versus Creon, but two kinds of not just principles, but in terms of two possibly legal systems. And that is so, and that it is not in the simply in the level of abstraction, but the argument at least in these sort of position that it is actually a historical event of transformation from a matriarchy to patriarchy, that is sort of condensed by a myth, right, whenever that event was, and that myth is sort of revealing or giving us in certain ways kind of. So, for Heyme, it is a matriarchal demand realized in its extreme and would promise no progress either. So, it is certain kind of a Creon on one side, a patriarchal principle, Antigone, it is a change of one legal system into another, but in that change necessarily, so it is two counter forces, but that forces is part of forces of history, and yet it is not necessarily that even that what Creon's move or the movement of towards patriarchy would be for Heyme and for others like even Bloch and others. It is certain kind of development without progress. It is sort of moving from certain things to complete a certain form of development of the state, etc., but without what they call progress. And the Antigone position also for them is in certain sense, it is not necessarily something that is actually realized in its extreme, also would not necessarily promise a certain kind of progress. Now, this is sort of the space in which things are happening, and what he sort of conceptualizes this world of looking for origin or looking for commonalities or sort of European and Indian civilization. What it is, or at least what he attempts to do, is to kind of bring that under this new space, which is kind of crucial, which is outside the cathedral, but basically digging up the whole place and kind of converting that under a huge kind of shamiana, a tent, and creating a space for theatre in this sort of really earthy kind of way, right. So, you will see the acting space is divided between, on one hand, on one kind of corner is Creon's fortress, where on the ruler's mountain rises a bamboo construction crowned with cow, steer skulls, plastered with mud, and distinct a place of the dead, which is sort of ditch filled with water between them. 3 holes in the mud, which we will see in the photograph soon. In the mud at the center, used by Antigone and Ismene, from which they crawl out and crawl back. Simple clothes, etc., and building a linkage between Antigone and Ismene as kind of earth. So, there is a mountain of bones, skeletons for the Tiresias is kind of one. There are vultures on stage, actual vultures who are live vultures, who are 3 of them who are under the Tiresias the graveyard. Candles, lighting certain ways, cow, which kind of becomes an important kind of figure within the production, etc. Now, so what it sort of, in a certain way, it sort of produces. So, you creating, you are digging up, and they kind of, we will see that they bring mud, kind of 280 lorries of mud is sort of brought in and sort of created this space, which is sort of creating this sort of almost kind of what a landscape of death that you kind of move into, right. Now, what, on one hand, what is this? We saw Hamlet machine and other things, like really breaking the structures using technology, bodies are kind of really fragmented, lot of that sort of work that Heyme does. But he comes here and then, picks up on another kind of problematic, and like Peter Marx, who has written about this sort of moment and his move, that there is one of the things that is even within Germany that is being stressed or within is felt, is this sort of limitations of the national discourse and the need to kind of really, directors moving into a global concern, and Heyme being a particular crucial example because of lot of things, including the oil crisis, lot of events that are happening around it, which kind of gives a sense of an ecological disaster, that an impeding ecological disaster is sort of really there, and that is where you're kind of really imagining a space of Antigone myth within this sort of world of the, to kind of narrate the global kind of condition, right. And you will see and another, but unlike some of the interculturalists that we will see from maybe tomorrow and somebody like Peter Brook, etc., this is clearly within a political theatre tradition, and from Piscator onwards, that tradition, even if it's from West Germany, etc. One of the things that we kind of really important here is kind of what is the Calcutta that they are encountering, or what is the larger, if there is an India that you are encountering. Yesterday also we had questions of what is this India or not India, right. That is the kind of a question that seems to be the intercultural question. But here what we are encountering, so it's double part. On one hand, it is not an India in this cultural terms that is the issue. It is not Calcutta, which is, as a cultural or a certain kind of identity that is the issue. It is Calcutta or India as a space within capitalist or within a certain kind of global history in that particular moment. That is what is at stake, even for somebody like Heyme. So, why Antigone and Sophocles in Calcutta? Western scientific progress is responsible for a hell like Calcutta, and that's exactly his words, right. It is a hell like Calcutta is actually produced by Western scientific discourse, right. In contrast to this stands postulate of an original nature inside of Antigone, a matriarchal demand connected with an early cult, which realized in extreme would promise, like you said, no progress either. In Calcutta, we have in front of our eyes everyday chaos, which, if not radically attacked, threatens to explode at every moment. So, it is a particular kind of definition or particular kind of experience and imagination of a continuum of geographical spaces, right, linked to a certain kind of conditions of so, his descriptions, I am not going, there is a long kind of his sort of descriptions of Calcutta, what he is seeing. Of course, there is mud, there is sweat, smell, all of that, and kind of really I am picking up certain things which he kind of really graphically writes of a space of dying, utopia less refuge, of fear, distress, disgusting, uniquely cruel, as concrete, as real as no nightmare in Europe could ever have dreamed of, and as I have never seen before in any site in Turkey, Bolivia, Peru, Guatemala, or anywhere else, even in World War II, the Second German War, as it is called around the world. Right. So, this is a space that is being encountered and imagined with all, he's engaging with people, interacting with people, loving what is going on, the life, etc., but also very clearly kind of placing it in within a larger kind of capitalist system to kind of say this is what it is. It is a hell, it is a house of dead, it is almost like a slaughterhouse. It is a slaughterhouse, but which is sort of produced by the system itself. And how does he sort of, therefore, the question of Antigone is not, when he is saying it, going back to origin, commonalities of European and Indian civilization. What is at stake is also this sort of doubling, right. On one hand, this is about going back to the past, myth, etc., historic, in terms of going back to the past. On the other hand, Calcutta is so real. Calcutta is so real in terms of its poverty, in terms of what it does. So, in a sense, what is the historicization? So, one would see historicization, that is also a strategy he does, and lot of other theatre makers would now kind of probably pick up on political theatre. Is the question, is how you do historicization through possibly a strategy of anachronism. That you go, it is not to create a period, it is not to create a perfect world of Antigone where things are authentic, you are transported into a world of mythic Greece, but it is precisely with anachronism that you actually produce this kind of really complex spaces. And I will just go through some of the four certain kind of anachronism to set up. So, on one hand, you can see that earlier kind of he's, like I said, he has done Antigone before, say for instance the Cologne production before this, which was like, which was the space was actually a very, very kind of created like a space of a cave. You look at the photographs, you have kind of full armor, actors are in full armor, very, very heavy kind of work. It's almost like a claustrophobic space, very small, congested, but claustrophobic space that is there. And here, creating a Shamiana tent which is so open with kind of really spaces between. So, that is a contrast that he is sort of bringing up. And it starts with, of course, very slightly again anachronistic, a certain kind of start with the chorus singing out the Brecht's poem of Antigone, but he is not doing a Brechtian Antigone, right. But a poem, Brecht's poem, Antigone is sort of first sung out, and that reference is already put up and then kind of moves on, right. So, creating a certain kind of, we could see some of the production, this is rehearsals of work, but some of the spaces that you will see, like I said, there are 3 mud holes in which people, Antigone and Ismail are coming out, they kind of come out in the start of the production from the earth, the hole in certain sense, kind of dark hole of certain kind of, and kind of go back to earth in that way. Chorus, physical acting, those are things that he would start concentrating, because it is a huge space that is being constructed and kind of really working with. And lot of discussions after that would be also, because these are really, like I said, they did not get the actors that they possibly would have otherwise got. So, these are really fresh actors, very amateur, very inexperienced actors, particularly therefore, they would select 2 really young people to play Antigone and Ismail, more malleable, and who become quite, important actors in that, in their own rights, but sort of working with them. So, lot of comments on acting is not to the level, but it is all physical acting, etc., that they are kind of working with. And the second part of it, certain kind of anachronism, that what it does is that it also is, this is a space where you kind of where you pass through this and then you get into the tent, which have photographs kind of displayed. So, you can see that Hamlet machine, which I kind of, that I kind of showed in the right at the start, is also placed there. Because he came like 15 days late, because Hamlet, that production, itself was very controversial. The actor after who was playing Hamlet sort of collapsed, and because he could not carry on performing that. So, Heyme himself performed that role to kind of complete the production schedule. Then he came late. So, all of that is up in the air, the news is there. So, it is also there as a Hamlet is sort of. But what we are seeing otherwise, which is not clear in this photograph, are images from Vietnam War, right. So, you see a lot of, and we know lot of images, very kind of trigger warning, these are quite violent images which were quite out there in the world, La Palme, the bombings, all of that. Now, it has a set of these sort of, which is sort of, you really walk through a foyer which has all these images, and also in the, even in the production in the graveyard, Tiresias's that graveyard also, you will in the background there are these photographs. So, actually the audience would see within the graveyard there is some, behind that is actually Vietnam photographs. So, it's, and yet it's not part of the script, it's not part of the text, nothing, but it is just certain things that kind of really frame positions for you. Right. Another kind of really more humorous one, but I think it's actually very interesting because it goes to the heart of the theatre, which is its materiality, which is something that is, which look at the scale of it. You know, you dug up the whole place and you're creating this whole new space with a kind of a river flowing in between it, because that's how the space is cut. Look, you know, in the midst there is a sort of river. After a point, you know, it becomes a river of blood, etc. So they needed all this mud. Now, where do you get all this mud to create certain things? So 280 trucks of mud was brought in from the metro site, which is just started construction. The new metro, the first time Calcutta is having a metro, so it's kind of brought from there. Now, that is very interesting, and this is kind of news again, kind of audience knows this, etc. So, even in my interviews or things that I measured, a very strong critique of it was that, say, Shamik Bandyopadhyay, for instance, would make a very strong critique that this just does not work, because this mud is from the metro. This mud is being taken from the metro, which is a certain kind of sign of progress or a sign of, you know, really kind of affirmatory things that are happening, and therefore, the landscape of death does not work. Now, this is very strange, but these are kind of really strong positions, and we can see what does theatre do with materials and what does sort of meaning makings happen precisely. And I would say, if that is the argument, then for instance, for productions like this or even a Piscator tradition, precisely because of that doubling of it, that, you know, that is precisely something that would be used for a development, would be used for, or something that is regarded as a point of progress would definitely something that would be used for the making it the landscape of death itself. And that's sort of really something that is sort of very important. So that to kind of really create a certain kind of productive anachronism that would really ground it, so that your audience is always in certain kind of ambivalence of what is that you are seeing in certain ways. And it's also kind of linked to larger sort of questions about. Therefore, I'm harping on this anachronism because this is very important, and this tradition is kind of important because you can see possibly was not the tradition at that point, definitely in the Indian context of political theatre, but probably even now possibly I think one can see a lot more, even though genealogy to this production is not at all there, but you can see ripples, or you can see what is happening now in terms of the large scale theatre productions and the ones that are trying to do political, you know, kind of questions, raise political questions within them, might be doing certain things which are closer to that. You kind of create certain spaces for contemplation, certain kind of ways in which it sort of the space, the ways in which material kind of allows certain far more complex contemplations. And of course, the Vietnam War question is also ridden in contradiction, right? Because it is Heyme's position that, you know, you create a certain kind of frame of a tragedy, right? That Vietnam War is a tragedy for humanity. It is a tragedy for humanity, or it's a tragedy, it's the ultimate tragedy that is going on. And that is a frame, and that is a frame for this tragedy of Antigone to kind of then think where it is going. So, it gives you a very, very different sensibility to protest, to Vietnam War, for instance. You know, you have a director having a perspective of Antigone's narrative without necessarily saying Antigone's kind of rise is a rise of kind of oppressed in certain ways, because he is sort of saying that this is a tragedy in which sort of tragedy for humanity itself is something that also is a very, very strong Western, in a certain sense, it's a Western position per se, right? And that is something that will be taken up, because Vietnam would become really the heart of anti-colonial imagination, anti-colonial resistance. So, this kind of tragedy, and you will see a lot of Western press when you look at Vietnam, it will say it's always a tragedy. Why is it? Because Americans went there and kind of really lost the plot, right? So, it becomes actually a tragedy for the West. So, there are kind of all of these are written in these sort of, it is a theatre production or a kind of site a nodal point that kind of really brings out all of these complexities which are there. And I kind of end with that sort of kind of anachronism. So, on one sense, so I would say that this is possibly very interesting. A way to kind of see is that this is what we see as a kind of staging of what nowadays we call Capitalocene, that it is capitalism, what capitalism produces in terms of really the extremes of it, of collapse of ecological to all kinds of relations. So, it is a kind of really complex space of staging of Capitalocene. But the irony of it is, and that is a question that we should keep asking, how does theatre stage Capitalocene? That, you know, if you stage the Capitalocene, then when you have the mud from metro, you have done it, where does the mud go back to? Does it go back to the same metro site or same dump yard, or the smaller question, but a very important one, the animals, etc., which is used in there. Actually, they got these vultures who are buying it, so people got very offended that you need these actual animals there, but he wanted to create the whole kind of feel. So, there was a cow, you know, which is sort of part of the scene, and Heyme was very, very particularly concerned about the cow and kind of took a liking to the cow and asking what will happen to the cow after the production. And then the production manager said, probably slaughterhouse, where else will the cow go? Cow might go to the slaughterhouse. Now, but that's interesting, that's a crisis, but that's exactly the crisis of a theatre of that scale, of certain kind of political theatre that we want to think about, that we stage Capitalocene, we reflect and contemplate, and then also what happens after that. So, how do we kind of negotiate these tensions is also something inbuilt into the theatric questions of materiality of theatre. So, I stop there and I thank you so much. Any quick questions, or what is the time like? 6 o'clock, we have half an hour, but anyway, yeah. Are there any other questions in the back or in the side? Let's give a minute for. No? It's also
If two questions actually. One is that this is a sort of post-colonial exercise in, not post-colonial exercise, but receiving of this imagined geography, in that, if one borrows that term, there's this imagined geography that is being put on this space. Who is it being imagined for? Because the place where it is being done is actually the one. I mean, they know the truth. They don't need this like this realization of what capitalism does is probably something that the countries that need to know, and where the waste goes, and the dystopia that he wants to imagine, while created very beautifully, it has its own biases, but also it's being, whom is it being imagined for, this dystopia? Because this has a very clear binary of the sort of the progress and then the dystopia. So my question was, the idea of imagined geography in a post-colonial context, and then whom is this dystopia being sort of imagined for, with its vultures and the cow?
Yeah, no, two parts. I wouldn't fully agree with you. I wouldn't fully agree with you in the sense that then you don't need any political theatre in India, no? We know, everybody knows capitalism is bad, or everybody knows, you know, all kinds of oppressions are bad, then you don't need political theatre. Then we have moved into some epic age, I suppose, very golden age. But that's exactly what political theatre does is the questions of Capitalocene, questions of critique of capitalism. These are all, you know, these are for all places in different ways, and it might have be localized differently, etc. But India is also a space at all points to be discussing those, and has to be staged. So this is absolutely staged for the quote unquote people in Calcutta, for nobody else. This runs whatever days that it kind of 5 weeks it is sort of put on. No, it is houseful. It runs also in practical terms. It does run houseful. People are attracted to kind of this sort of, you know, stagings, etc. But it is really for the space itself. But it is and I have no issues also. I would not critique, because it's a very valid critique. It is a valid critique. It's a valid critique in terms to imagine also, even in a post-independence India, it's an important kind of political, even that framework of tragedy, even a framework of really that sort of dystopia is also actually quite important. I think political theatre could have space for that also. Now the other part of it, which is there in terms of maybe even the Fritz or even others, even you might have an international spirit or you might have other modes to come, but these are also points when other kind of vectors become important. Other points of vectors are important, and that is where a lot of negotiation, and that part I didn't kind of go into we know all about the questions of cow, we have acting, all of these are also kind of really recorded as debates and discussions between actors. He did not know, of course, Bengali, so they are working with translators. So every day they are kind of discussing what is the staging, and you have lots of records of actors saying and kind of making strong position on this is what we don't like, this does not work in India, this is not to our meaning, some of it which is incorporated into production, some of which is rejected by him, but he would still stage the cow, that I still want the cow. Now one could have certain kind of positions on, this is not, and yet I would say, kind of I think that question kind of suddenly kind of because that's I think is the intercultural framing problem, that we know everything, or we know what is authentic, we know what is our space, and this person has come from outside. I don't think that's the lens to kind of look at, but but contacts create certain kind of contradictions. It also allows certain kind of new things which cannot be named, or things which cannot be also possible. Things cannot be captured so easily might also be possible in those spaces of contradictions. So that's my, at least. Yeah.
No, you can go.
No.
My question is rather a extension of what Nisha's asking, but what was India's take in this kind of a cultural exchange? For example, this particular production that you're talking about, here is a director of a certain, position that they hold within the theatre making scene in the world order, but then to come to India and make a work with, say, like you say, right, amateur artists. What was India's take in these kinds of cultural exchange? What is it that, what was happening in using such bodies or such kind of theatre making, wherein India's proposition was in the larger sort of discourse of critique of the capitalist model?
No, India's space in two ways, I would say. One is that India is really a center of Cold War politics. And culture became, in 70s and 80s, it became the site through which that is done. Because India is in the third world now, a lot of these sort of internationalism that is there. Therefore, there is a clear kind of investment of India as a space from both worlds in certain ways. So this is these are kind of start of these processes where things are happening, and this would go on, and this would sort of, they would not actually, and they would, rather than kind of, when they tried professionalization, they would leave that model out. They would say that's not the workable model, but they will move to other ways, and then Gunther and others, lot of others who will come, and Max Mueller makes this becomes actually a very, very strong template for them to do, even though they could not kind of or they didn't want at that scale. Even actually they had promise of maybe taking this to villages. He wanted to take it, and it would have been interesting how he would have kind of completely transformed to take something like this into villages, but he wanted to do it, but that didn't work out. So there is some kind of ripple effect definitely for Max Mueller. They're kind of thinking, and then it becomes something that they keep doing, and we know how Max Mueller is such a big kind of cultural kind of nodal center for a lot of work. Right, so that is important in terms of it becomes and India is really crucial because of its place within the larger politics within the developing countries, and you will say these are isolated ones, but you will quickly see people like what we see, the foundation, kind of really performance studies, Eugenia Barber, Schechner, all of them are coming via, they are in the whole discourse of interculturalism is a discourse under Cold War, only that you don't say that what it is, right? It has been produced under Cold War. All of them are coming under conditions of Cold War and coming from actually the Western kind of context also. So there is very clearly this is right. IFA will come, Ford, Ford now IFA, Ford will come in with very, very strong kind of investment in certain kind of. So this is a period when all of this churning is sort of happening. So neither am I say Cold War, therefore money is from there, therefore you kind of write off. But I think we need to understand where certain things are emerging from. The theatre of the roots, a lot of those sort of linkages are there. At least propositions, funding patterns are changing. Yeah, I think.
I also sort of would like to follow up, and I would like to connect it to a term that Vishnupriya has slipped in her argument a little bit in passing, but I think it's interesting. And you spoke about the positive tragedy, or the tragedy with a positive perspective, and that is a huge question. For example, within the GDR, that they tried to develop a political doctrine that political theater should be positive to a certain extent and should show something where things develop to. And I think what I find interesting, I would ask you to expand a little bit on that, to what extent Heyme sort of rather aims at a deeper level of the concept of tragedy that has to do with mourning. So in the sense of acknowledging a reality, also the reality that is a crisis, in rather an affective response than sort of in outlining something that would be a positive perspective. Is that something sort of you would see in Heyme's work on tragedy?
Yeah. I think so. In a sense that this is a frame. I wouldn't say cynicism, but mourning is a better word. In a sense, it's not cynicism, but this is about tragedy at a global humanity, tragedy of humanity, and Calcutta becomes the site to see it. You can't see it any other place, or for him, this is the place which we have to see to kind of actually then think about the world itself. So that is why you don't see too much of, there is nothing of, the set is landscape of death, so it's not Calcutta. It is not India. There is music. They are using certain kind of music. They're working with actors, sort of Hindustani music. They are doing certain things with it, but not in terms of, and some kind of dressing, but not in terms of showing India, because it does not have to be placed, because this is Antigone myth. This is somewhere else, but it could become kind of a larger question of. And so Vietnam War is very clearly that kind of Vietnam War already kind of is kind of all that bombings have happened, things are changing, and now what you do? Is it a heroic kind of, that would be the anti-colonial kind of perspective, that this is heroic, this is something that has defeated the US. That would be one position, but one would be to kind of see the whole thing as a tragedy, right? So I think that is different kind of, and then you mourn for it, which would be, I think so, because this is a tragedy where everybody dies, and Antigone, it's like so many people are dying, including Creon at the end, right? So it's sort of really on and on.
So when you say the GDR was doing it, are you meaning GDR was doing it in the GDR, or when they are sort of doing these cultural exchanges?
No. Only within the GDR. Sort of there was quite a considerable discussion in the 1950s and 60s when the politicians tried to set up a framework, to establish a new culture within the GDR. So the idea was that every play should have a positive perspective. Walter Ulbricht at one point sort of coined this interesting phrase saying, "We will write Faust Part 3." So this will have a positive ending, and I think. Here and this has been so powerful, at least in the German discourse about political theater. This is how I compared it. I did not refer to the Indian.
There was also the debate, but it was a bit different in the sense that, when it, I don't know how to sort of place it, because there were plays which were sort of about the coal miners, right? And the last scene is when the coal miners are actually drowning in an accident, and where the industrialists, and this was a real incident. And later Utpalrat said that this is not the way I would have ended the play, because it shows the workers dying. And then there was, these sort of historical plays which were coming in. And as you know, Rustam Barucha's first book, The Rehearsals of a Revolution, sort of said that, by changing the end and ending in that sort of a positive way, because when you're showing these anti-colonial movements, a lot of them, of course, ended in a failure because the British sort of consolidated the power. So there was that whole, and he said that's a distortion of history. And then the reference would always come back to Battleship Potemkin, that Aurora doesn't, but actually they lose. Similarly, in the play about the naval mutiny, Heyme, which is the ship they did do the whole revolt in, it stands out till the end. It doesn't surrender. The sailors don't surrender. And I think Rustam's critique also sort of came from that, of course the naval mutiny failed. So, and then the argument is, but, and then Brecht again becomes an important reference point. But that's what, the whole, it's a very important political theatre debate, right?
Yeah. But I think what is so interesting, this is, how I sort of saw your line is that obviously in the 1970s and 80s something is shifting in the concept of political theatre, in the sense that it is less interventionist in terms of providing a solution or perspective, but rather acknowledging a specific kind of reality, at least in the German context, I would say.
Particularly in Calcutta, I would say it was the 1980s, 70s. Really, the agonism transformed into antagonism because of the emergency, the political insurgent movement around Nakhchiavali. It's after the left comes to power, and I also don't believe that political theatre came to an end because, now you can't be so anti-establishment as you were before. But then those historical repertoires started coming in, so it changed its course.
And even here in the debates one of the debates between actors and Heyme is on Antigone, what happens, and they would say actors would make a position that after emergency, this is just after emergency, we can't show resigned Antigone, we can't show an Antigone who's going to death with, that there needs to be something. But that you can see that there is a real tension on this interpretation has to be more positive, more kind of interventionist. But I guess that Heyme doesn't kind of, at least they finally don't kind of go that direction. But that is there. So you can see within the group or within even the actors, that is kind of the feeling that we want more kind of, what do we do with Antigone, who's sort of,
I have a question to you. You asked your question. Okay. And that is this, the way you're describing the scenography and, the way the actors were sort of submerged in this mud and the water and stuff. I was just sort of thinking of, that sort of stoic gesture of protest. And Antigone is the example which Jenny Hughes and Simon Parry uses in that, the contemporary theatre review about the gestures of protest. So it's really not Antigone, but Ismene who, stands there and protest. So here, does the scenography build into that?
I wouldn't be able to. But there is that, the relationship.
Deshra said, how difficult it
is. In a sense, to do it was difficult because it's also earth dressing in terms of even costume. They would kind of be wiped up. They are like earth itself, so their whole bodies are kind of with clay, etc. And there's also very intimate. I don't know how to, because the text is there, but there's also seems to be a very slightly different interpretation of Antigone and Ismene in terms of really they are together, they are in the whole, they're kissing, there seems to be some kind of really sort of so I think that even the older of his productions on his interpretation of Antigone and Ismene are kind of really intense, sort of, they are paired together, almost like a really almost sometimes in certain sense people might feel sexual relations, that sort of really intense kind of, and you can see those images here also. So that is there, and then kind of then crawling out from the earth and going back to the earth, and so that kind of relation is very strong, I think. But I wouldn't be able to fully say at this point that if that is sort of Ismene is very strong, because that's interesting, because later when for example, in Anuradha's production, I don't think there's even an Ismail. Things have changed. There's something else that she is also playing with, but which is also Max Mueller production, but Brechtian Antigone. So that's a very different kind of Antigone, right? Yeah.
You said something like that this space where they are performing Antigone is sort of artificially created what they wanted, like it is very utopian and created, crafted in some sense. So my question is, why do they choose Calcutta? Like, I didn't understand why they chose Calcutta. If the space is being created, it is being crafted, it can be any other city for that matter. Like, are they seeking any specific certain kind of audience, or is there another reason for that?
Probably I'm not be able to fully, in a sense that Calcutta, Delhi they come to in terms of, some of it is practicalities. Delhi is a center, Calcutta is of course a center with Max Mueller, and so he comes to Delhi, he watches certain things, he does have some interaction in Delhi, but I guess Fritz Benowitz is already in NSD, so there is already something going on. Fritz has also gone to Calcutta, so there seems to be some kind of choices being made in terms of what is practical and what would be more fruitful. And Calcutta is a center, and it is a theatre city. It is if you want to do theatre and make an intervention, probably in that period, Calcutta is the place to go. No, it is a theatre city in that sense. So that, and kind of it for Heyme, then you encounter Calcutta, you can encounter it because it is a city like that, of a significance like that, that you could kind of place in terms of that. So it's not, so he's not staging Calcutta, but he's staging Calcutta in a different way. For him, Calcutta is this sort of, I would call it, it's that point which brings together Capitalocene kind of alive. Because it's the hell that capitalism produces with all the living things. We should quickly go into your.
No, it's okay. We can just discuss three of us together.
Okay.
I did mention Amal, and I'm sure you will take that from now.
Okay. No, we can have some discussion.
This is very little. Because we were talking about genealogies and sort of how do you disturb genealogies when you see something like a sort of the socialist sort of things coming in, intervening in a theatre making process. And I was thought of using Amala Lana as a case study and the example of how she disturbs all the genealogies. Ideally, she's Ibrahim Al-Qazi's daughter, and she studied in the National School of Drama. She's sort of developing, she's the chair. And this sort of direct, linear sort of, genealogy we look at is so disturbed when she just, goes to the GDR, which is completely different, this sort of methods than what her father had sort of started. She comes back and she does King Lear, and Al-Qazi had done a very important production of King Lear, and NSD curriculum was always production oriented, right? They used to showcase the performance, and then she does Mother Courage, and again just to go with Amal, she does it in Pragati Maidan in a huge, I can't remember, it was I think 60 acres or something like that in the place. So she uses these huge Kathakali costumes. Arjun Raina is sort of performing there with that whole costume swirling. And then it's, this frail Manohar Singh, her father's student, one of the big stars who he had created, is Lear. And then she makes a shift to Mother Courage, which is one of her major productions. And again, the way she describes her process, you will see it's so similar to what Anuradha Kapoor is attributing to the Benowitz method. And she worked more closer, both in Weimar and in Delhi with Benowitz. And, in one A, she says that in Mother Courage, Alana is very clear that she did not want Manohar Singh to impersonate a woman. So she casts Manohar Singh as Mother Courage. I did not want him to take on gender identities through costume or any artificial means, breasts or stomach, but since his own embodied gendered signs and identifying them, particularly an actor coordinated to portraying conventional gendered roles. Amal Alana says that Singh was particularly interested in hand gestures and how women's hands works. So it's the external gesture which would sort of, create this gender fluidity, transform him for this man to the woman. And together with Maya Rao as an invited collaborator, they improvised on scenarios such as courage facing sexual violence, courage pregnant, and exploring relationship between parents and children. Alana recalls that it was a long drawn out process, and many times finding the gender neutrality is to be able to make the transitions was difficult and full of obstacles. The real breakthrough came when Alana asked Singh to speak the way his mother did for Mother Courage, and suddenly, she said, demonstrating women came out naturally. Speaking in his mother's Himachali dialogue, and initially she thought she'll do it in Rajasthan, she shifts it. So like Benowitz, used to tell them, be flexible, break down everything to a few impulses, then reconstruct. Speaking in his mother's Himachali dialect, inflected with local dialect, the male persona ultimately shifted to the female and created the gender fluidity that they were seeking to work on further. This, Alana says, anecdotally made them change the locale of Mother Courage from where they originally intended to locate it in Rajasthan to Himachal, and along with the actor, the spatial milieu changed irrevocably. I wanted to show you a part, but we can skip that. So Manohar Singh's portrayal of Mother Courage and the strategy of masquerade is therefore seen as an important landmark in feminist practice in India. Anuradha Kapoor writes, Amal Alana seeks to make gender mobile, as it were, by disturbing stereotypes. This she does by shifting and restructuring the elements of gender in a production of Himmat Mai, for example, where she reallocated the attributes of femininity and masculinity, passivity, patience, nurturing sympathy on one hand, aggression, courage, bravery, single-mindedness, and authority on the other, from a woman's role to a man's body and vice versa, and thus redefine them. So, I was just trying to also set the stage for Indu tomorrow, that somewhere they are breaking those, natural sort of genealogical inheritance and lineages, which of course theatre history loves. But again, by breaking, there's some sort of genealogical connection they have to remake to make the connect. But it's a far more complicated thing. And, Al-Qazi had a very sort of non-feminist, non-gendered sensibility. And then if you say that, Amal's sort of gender intervention in the gender comes directly from the lineage, it doesn't, right? It's also sort of a break and cuts and where those sort of come and amalgamate together. So that's how it is. So, something to think about. And again, I find it very strange that both she and Anamika Haksar decide to go to Eastern Europe to train. Anamika Haksar goes to Soviet Union. So why? When they could have generally gone to RADA. But it was also important, RADA is the colonial tradition. And if what I was saying that, this whole idea that Shakespeare was the colonial canon, then the earlier generation like Al-Qazi and Utpal Dat was sort of reworking the canon according to a sort of a post-colonial understanding, but they never killed off the author. And if anybody does, it will be Alana, Anuradha Kapoor, Maya Rao, that generation, who will then, deconstruct the canon, kill Shakespeare, and even in a way kill Brecht. So, they would start with things like St. Joan of the Stockyard. Then both Anuradha and Maya Rao would do Brecht's short story, The Job, in a very sort of the dramaturgical intervention which Brecht tells you to do, but adapting to their feminist sensibilities, bringing in the idea of narratives, because it's a short story. So, that's where really iconoclastic denigration happens to the canons, which would include Brechtian texts. But that's the larger picture which I wanted to give.
Okay, we have 10 minutes, so any questions or?
Vishnu Priya, go back to a point from your earlier presentation. There was the question about the concept of folk and sort of how Benevitz sort of seemed to have a very different concept of folk than in the Indian context. I would assume, and I apologize because here I'm only aware of the German part of the discussion, but within the GDR, the political doctrine prescribed a specific kind of realism that banned certain theatrical forms. And the only way to get away with other theatrical forms was to claim that they were of a plebeian origin, or that they were part of a specific socialist heritage that one could reclaim. This is how Heine Mueller gets away with the help of Rudolf Münz at a certain point, because sort of Münz says, well, this is a plebeian tradition of folk theater. Do you see in Benevitz's work, sort of looking at his side of the equation, sort of this search for alternative aesthetic forms as well in the encounter with Indian theater, or does he sort of rather come as a missionary, sort of simply entrenched in his own aesthetic discourses?
I think that's what Anuradha Kapoor is implying, that there was this certain conjuncture where in India, the sort of what is the people's art, what is the people's form, was an important concern before, Ford Foundation comes in and appropriates the folk and all that funding and things come. So she's saying that before that, there was that exploration into what is a people's art forms, which had suffered a lot because of the colonial sort of marginalization, impoverishment. So the way we today would, not use the term, or we would look at it as a statist project, or, how they would sort of really be reduced to, where the people is not present, it's like an empty signifier of the people and they're sort of celebrating. She's saying at that point in the 60s, there was a potential of looking at it as a folk art form, and where really the people are and things like that. Now she's seeing Benevitz's work with the materiality, and which also becomes their very important thing, as sort of bringing the two sensibilities together, but never saying that Benevitz, did what will later become the theatre of the roots, or took a certain folk form and put it within his performance or the play. He never did that, at least with the NSD productions. And in the early stages, I don't know, later he may have done it in Bhopal and things, or Nina Sam. I think Suraj would be able to tell. Did Benevitz adapt folk forms in Nina Sam, or traditional? Because here, I remember seeing both Caucasian Chalk Circle of Carl Weber's and a Threepenny Opera. They were Brecht's model book productions. But what his students felt, that there was a lot of liberty in constructing those scenes according to their own sort of improvisation, identities, their own local cultures. If somebody wanted to bring it, fine. But I don't think it was sort of imposed. But maybe Suraj would know more about the Nina Sam Because those were his later works, and by the time he may have been more confident to look at folk form.
Actually, Subbana wrote a piece on like his Fritz Benewit's whole like the process. So I think there is a I think I have a question related to this, because if I see the description of what Subbana and even Ninasam has Fritz Benewit's big photo in its office. First entrance only Fritz Benewit's, then you will go inside. So, but if we see the Subbana's description, it's a very descriptional, like what he does with actors and how he's training, his methods. Finally, he says he's a great like actor training, but whole discussion and description is like more kind of aggressive kind of actor training, and that kind of like in terms of like power structure or how he treats actors, and how in terms of rigor or that Guru Shishya Parampara, that kind of in India we do that. But so the whole description is that the physical abuse, physical harm in that sense, and also that mental pressure. So all of that Subbana writes, and at the end of his he writes like all of this guides to the actor training, whatever the narrative is. So of course that traditional imposition is there, means that kind of because even now that genealogy is following, like there are few old NST directors, Sargunandan sir and some other old NST like Akshara sir's batchmates and Anamika sir's batchmates. They are actually trained with Fritz Benewitz, and they are like taking that kind of rigorous kind of training methods. So they are all like now after, means as an actor I feel like it will work well. Means I also at some point in my journey I read that and I am like this is actor training. We have to train actors like this. But after like thoda sa alien, okay, then if we see, then it's a different thing. So now I was thinking while you were talking, I was completely thinking about that only. Like when we say like political theatre and we are like to achieve something, we whatever the political regime is, like we are like fighting against it, those power hierarchies, and there is a power hierarchy in the theatre, which is the like director. So then that questions even Amit sir like asked in his last year, like it's both like. So I'm in that it's a little complicated.
I think in the actor training institutions that discipline was accepted. And jokes, this is a joke, don't repeat. National School of Drama spoiled brats need it. I think they really needed Al-Qazi and Benewitz to be imposing discipline on them, because they're completely, that's why they did create a generation of good actors for a time and then it died out. But similarly, when Benewitz actually came to work with professional actors, there were really, it was very aggressive, very alienating, and not only with us when he did Himmat Mai, but also when he worked in the GDR. In Weimar, his actors really sort of rebelled. And I would say, I also studied in the Ernst Busch Hochschule, which is the GDR drama school. It is not that, sort of rigid discipline, which RADA is. Because I was 1 year in RADA and then I changed. They are not. They are far more, they talk to you and get it. But Benewitz has never taught in the Ernst Busch. It was Manfred Weckworth and, a lot of other people who were sort of teaching, including even Heyme Mueller taught for a year's time. But there was no, so I think for actor training method and something which had been set up in the RADA model by Al-Qazi, and he was a disciplinarian himself, I think Benewitz went very well. And what he introduced was, a sort of a different method which had connotations of a socialist ethos. And I think Anuradha only talks about, which I find very interesting, that maybe it's not that ideological Brecht which somebody like Utpal Dutt and that theatre would adapt, but it was a more ethical Brecht, and that came through Benowitz. Benowitz brought a sort of a Brechtian strategy which would allow them later to, sort of work with material, the materiality. And you know how the feminists have elaborately worked with it, Raman, Indu, Meenakshi, they've all sort of worked with it quite a bit. And I think that's the part, as a method, breaking into method, it was the alternative to the Al-Qazi method, which I think was more phenomenological body, the voice, use of the, sort of, it was very Rada, I felt, yeah.
But in Ninasam, I think it's much more complicated because it's a communitarian. Actors are like.
That's what I wanted you to ask.
Was working, it's a actually proper. It's not like school as such. When actually he came, so it's little complicated. I don't know how it worked and all. I don't know, but it's really complicated in that way. Because Subarna has a different method of like teaching, like drama, like it's a discussion, democratic, like okay, you are bringing this kind of different kind of way, because it's come from Lohia and socialist, that kind of way. But this kind of like, and even like Vivekanand is also not like that aggressive in that sense. Vivekanand is also like smooth going and singing mostly, like a different kind of training method. But I don't know like how that community accepted it. And still there is a photo, it's the big photo of Fritz Benowitz.
I think that's
a
colonial legacy of the superior race. Because he was a white man, I think they accepted it.